Yeah, thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I was kind of unsure what to present here because I know that the audience is interdisciplinary and I'm coming from a disciplinary background, although I've been more and more involved also with interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary issues. And but I still kind of figured that exactly the growth angle, which is usually my kind of main playing field, would be a little bit too strong, although we would probably have lots of discussions there, but I kind of figured it might get too heated and we might get nowhere then. So I kind of looked into, yeah, what could I do? And actually this climate policy, a social dilemma, the way I look at it is still very much economic, but I think it's easy to see also where the input of other disciplines can actually help a lot. And so the topic today, climate policy, a social dilemma. I'm not quite sure what the rules are here. Is it allowed to ask in between, or do the technical people there have a problem with that? Okay, that's okay. So feel free to ask also in between. Yeah, okay. So climate policy, a social dilemma. The first time I was confronted with this expression, a social dilemma, I was kind of like, what is that? And so this is basically where my starting point for this presentation is. Basically, economists deal with the same type of questions a lot of times. We just label it a little bit different. We usually label it either public good problems or provision of public good or natural resource dilemmas or tragedy of the commons and so on. So a social dilemma is probably perhaps a little bit more specific than the typical angle that we take. I've given two excerpts here from one article, which I think pretty much say clearly what's actually meant. So the first one actually points to the fact that a group of individuals, which is basically the case if we deal with climate change or with many other public goods or natural resource problems, share a common resource by balancing short-term self-interests against long-term group interests. So why is that different from the usual public good problem or even the tragedy of the commons? Because the time horizon is usually not considered in these types of questions, although that does play a role in many cases. Here it's explicitly referred to that you basically have a short-term decision to make that then not impacts necessarily the present with respect to the benefits that you can get from it, but it affects a lot the future that you're facing. And then the question arises whether to cooperate for the good of the group or to defect for personal gain. And that is again very close to what we usually have also in economics with respect to public good provision or tragedy of the commons. Do I actually try to do what's best for the group? Do I, for example, the typical grazing problem is, the typical tragedy of the commons is the grazing problem, where there's basically one field and everybody can share, and so the good thing would be to limit the number of people, the number of cows on there. And usually it's not done because everybody is just looking at what he can get from putting one more piece of cattle on that piece of land, and he's not considering what that might do to the overall benefits from actually using that land. And so this is the kind of typical thing. Do I cooperate? Do I not cooperate? Do I try to reap my benefits solely self-interested, or do I really look at the entire group? And now, of course, then the question is climate change a social dilemma? And I'm kind of highlighting here the parts that I find especially relevant with respect to this social dilemma or with respect to climate change. So on the one hand, sharing a common resource, which is obviously the case. We're dealing with climate change, so who's sharing that, or with who? Basically 6-7 billion people by now. So we have a large group of people who are interested in that. If you reduce that to the number of states, we're still in the range of about 200. So it's still a large number of people who have to cooperate in order to be able to protect the climate. And the second part is actually that individuals must choose whether to cooperate for the good of the group or not. And especially this is relevant for the climate change problem, because in climate change, or with respect to climate policy, we don't have one global institution that can enforce the rules. And that is basically at the core of the entire problem and on how to actually come to an agreement on climate protection. If you look at numbers, and I will show a little bit later, that concern other types of pollution problems, for example, local or regional pollution that also has only regional effects, like acid rain, or so the emission of nitrogen oxides or particles, you actually have the situation that in many countries this is already pretty much under control. And that exact reason for that, or one of the most important reasons for that, is that there is a global national authority that can actually enforce the rules. Once in a democracy everybody agrees, or the majority agrees, on protecting a certain environment, there can be rules and they can be enforced, which is of course also very important. I mean, you can make rules, as we have seen, for example, in the Kyoto Agreement, but the problem is then also to enforce them. Like we all know, Canada dropped out of the agreements once they realized they wouldn't be able to meet the goals they'd set for themselves, and nobody can really punish them because there's nobody to enforce the agreement, although these agreements just function if everybody adheres to the rules stipulated. And so that's basically one of the core problems that we have with respect to mitigation of climate change. So what we need is actually people to participate in voluntary agreements. So they voluntarily have to say, okay, I agree to have a certain level of climate protection to mitigate CO2 or other types of emissions, and I stick to the rules. Now, given, of course, that this is that's basically unimportant where you emit CO2. It's got the same consequences for the climate, and the same is true for mitigating it. Given that, we obviously face a free rider problem. So basically, I'd rather not do anything, do not incur the cost of doing something, and just hope the others will do something. So this is basically the situation that is then preventing, in many cases, states from voluntarily, or also groups or people, individuals, from voluntarily contributing to mitigation. So voluntary agreements. What does an economist think of voluntary agreements? The question that we ask first is, why the hell should they do it? Is it actually rational to contribute voluntarily? I mean, if you look at this simple, very simple cost and benefit analysis that I just did, you get the benefits if somebody else does it or you does it, but you get it for free, or you have to incur the cost yourself. Seems pretty easy to decide what you should do on an individual level. It doesn't say that individual rationality is necessarily identical with collective rationality. But from an individual point of view, if nobody can enforce the rules, it's the individual point of view that counts. There seems to be some doubts about why actually somebody should do it. So we should observe in reality that nobody is doing anything. Is that the truth? No, that's not the truth either, as we will see in a minute. And then, as we will see in a minute, that there is something happening. The question arises, what is actually happening due to voluntary contributions enough to stop climate change? Or can we perhaps influence how much is done voluntarily? And that is then basically coming to the core of what I'm going to present in a little while. Okay, so this is kind of the realm of questions that I'm dealing with, some more, some less in intensity, but this is, in a sense, the agenda of the talk today. Now, if I look at economic theory, game theory to be precise, game theory acts with strategic behavior of people, of nations, then I get to the rather dismal result that actually there does not seem to be a self-enforceable, so an agreement where nobody has an incentive to step out. It's not able to, you're not able to form a stable agreement like that that has more than 3 participants if the stakes are high. The stakes are high in climate change. I think we all agree on that. So that basically tells us that we should not expect, from theory, that there's going to be a large agreement. It can be a different result. That's also in the literature. It can be also optimal to have a large group cooperating, but that's usually when the stakes are low. So basically, if you're just getting a little bit more from cooperating that you would get otherwise. So that's, for example, people wondered why the ozone layer depletion agreement in Montreal worked. So one of the explanations that you find in the literature is actually that for some countries it seems to hold that whether they had done something individually or collectively doesn't make much of a difference. That then explains why countries do it anyway. And so whether they cooperate or not doesn't matter to them because they're going to do it anyway. But if the stakes are high, it's different. So basically, basic economic theory, game theory, tells us not to expect too much. Now, if you look at reality, this is just CO2 emissions, and I should have put that somewhere. CO2 emissions in 3 parts, or 2.5, 2 and a little part of the world, German, Europe, and the US. So we see that in each of these regions, actually emissions go down over time. In the US, pretty drastically after 2007, in Germany, quite continuously, and in Europe, also in the last years at least. Now, of course, is that due to CO2 mitigation? Is that due to voluntary action? You could argue no. I mean, the EU has rules, right? They have certain goals that they set. 20% until 2020, that has to be met, so that's obviously not voluntary. From an international point of view, it's still voluntary because there's no global authority to actually enforce that. So the EU voluntarily forms these rules to which you then have to adhere if you're part of the European Union. So Germany is part of that, obviously. Entirety of Europe, that's basically EU, I think 28, is subject to that. And of course, Germany looks so good, among other things, because we have also had the reunification, which then led to a drastic decrease. So we also had much more to actually reach. I think it was 23%, 21% of mitigation in the Kyoto Protocol, under the Kyoto Protocol, than other regions. With respect to Europe, altogether, of course, the downturn is also due to the fact that there is climate policy, that there are certain goals, that there are renewables policies, etc., formulated, energy efficiency goals. Now, in the US, it looks pretty good, but to a large extent, that's not, or the almost entire extent, that's not even due to voluntary contributions. That's basically the biggest downturn is due to the crisis, the financial crisis. But then also contributing is basically the fact that you have a switch from coal to gas in electricity production, and that is due to fracking. And why is fracking taking place? Not because, or not mainly because of climate change, but because of, on the one hand, individual profit interests, which didn't manifest in the way that they were hoping in the long run so far, but that was the original reason. And the second one, why did the government actually foster that? Because they wanted to be energy independent. At the same time, you had this kind of secondary benefit, that's actually reductions of CO2 emissions. So just going after the data and seeing whether it's a downturn doesn't really tell you everything. And also looking at the global curve, things don't look that promising anymore. I mean, here I should have said that everything is normalized to 1 at 1990. So this is always the year to which Kyoto relates. So this is like 100% in 1990. By 2012, we have almost 50% increase in CO2 emissions. So voluntary contributions obviously can get us only so far. It's not really noticeable in the global curve. But still, if you talk to people today, or especially this year, you get a quite positive impression as well. For example, China. China's emissions didn't rise last year for the first time in a very long time. Partly also due to new regulation. Not necessarily because of climate change, sometimes also because of other pollutants that you had. But climate change is factoring into Chinese considerations more and more. For example, you have also the agreement of the US and China. Now, some people argue that they are basically agreeing to what they already would have done otherwise. For example, China promising to reach the max of their emissions in 2030, or the US, I think it was 25% until 2025 in reductions. But still, it's the first time that they agreed on something. And also, what might be good is actually it's just 2 countries. It might be a stable coalition, according to what we heard before. Or I think the Economist actually said it's too small to fail. So this is perhaps one example that voluntary contributions do something, but so far, basically not enough. And that's just the one example I wanted to give you with respect to local This is actually SO2 emissions. In Germany, decline over the years. The colors are just the different sectors in which they arose. But you basically see what the national regulation can do here. If you have some enforceable rules, some enforceable laws, then it might go very fast. Of course, it's easier with respect to SO2 than it would be with respect to CO2. But nevertheless, you see the impact that actually one rule, one institution at the top can actually have. Okay, but with respect to climate change, we see some reduction of CO2 emissions in some parts of the world. We have in the EU, for example, considerable investment in different technologies that are designed to reduce CO2 emissions. But obviously, it's not enough. And the question also arises, is the EU simply stupid? Is it not rational? Should they not do that? I mean, some economists argue that it doesn't make sense. They should rather stop doing that because they basically give others incentive to not do anything because they're doing something. I mean, that's the good question. And perhaps also what can we learn actually from the voluntary contributions that we observe? What is driving them? That are questions that in my mind are kind of relevant. So this is kind of like the trip in the direction of my main field of research. You see an integral over time. Okay, so we're in the realm of dynamic control theory, but I'm not going to go into that. It's just kind of showing you how economists usually think about these types of decisions. Obviously, climate change is a long-run decision problem, or climate protection, so we have a long run. We have basically a time interval here from 0 to infinity, where somebody, might be the state, might be the individual, is actually deciding on how to allocate their resources over time. That might be investment in dirty technologies, clean technologies, that might be adaptation, that might be consumption, whatever. But it tells you on the one hand that we have some utility U that gives us utility function, that gives us utility. I'm not specifying yet what it depends on. That is kind of crucial. And we also see that we have this discount factor, as we label it. That's an exponential function to some constant times time that basically tells you that the future is less important to many people. It's kind of behavioral, what we observe, than the present. So people care more about what happens today than what happens in the far future. And there's a huge discussion in economics how we should actually determine this factor rho up there. The larger it is, the less future counts. Individual behavior suggests it's rather large. But basically also, if you look at the literature, for example, the Stern report that was dealing with should we invest, should we not invest, what are the consequences of not investing in climate protection, it says from a social point of view should be low. So basically to find a decision, we should assume it's low. So there's a huge discussion about that. But what we assume is that an individual is rational, and that's the question, is it rational to actually engage in voluntary policies or in voluntary mitigation? A rational individual maximizes this objective function, so this utility function, under the whatever given constraints. That might be technology, that might be limited financial resources that I have available. And if whatever this individual does, or the state does, adheres to this maximization problem, or this maximization principle, then it's acting rational. If it does something that would not be maximizing its benefits, its utility, whatever over time, wouldn't be rational. So that's the question we're kind of facing from an economics point of view. And of course you have, with respect to whatever you do, you have trade-offs. If you invest in clean technologies, investment in general means that you have to save something for the future. You can't consume today. It might be that you invest in green technologies, although the return on investment is lower than on dirty technologies, at least in the short run. So trade-offs are basically what drives entirety of economics. There's always costs and benefits. And the question, of course, now is what kind of benefits and costs arise with respect to climate change and climate protection. And that is basically then what fills the utility function. Now, if I talk to people who have some background in economics, mostly not too far, because then we're also introducing new concepts, but like in the first semesters, the only thing that's actually in this utility function is consumption. So basically, you're choosing whatever type of allocation of your funds over time that maximizes your present value from today's point of view of consumption over time. If you save something, it's just due to the fact that you want to consume more in the future. Nothing else matters. So that would be the very basic point of economics. Then if you go a little bit further, a couple semesters on, then you actually usually also have, or if you, at least in environmental economics, you have pollution, for example, in there, you have environmental quality in there, you might also have something like leisure in there that's also influencing your decision, how much to work and how much to earn and how much to save. So basically, you can, of course, also enlarge that. Now, with respect to climate change, there's a couple of very obvious costs and benefits that arise. Now, if you have faced the decision on whether to invest in mitigation or not, of course, you have, in the short run, investment expenditure that usually cannot be reimbursed. And so in the short run, you might face a reduction of income or a reduction of growth. Now, that's, of course, something, if the present is very important to you and the future not that much, which you care about a lot. Then on the other hand, you have also direct benefits, but those are usually not occurring directly. They occur later in time. And they usually, and that's one of the key things also about climate change as a social dilemma, you don't know how high they will be. If you look at the IPCC scenarios, there's a huge range of uncertainty about the damages from climate change, and therefore the reduction of those benefits if climate change does not arise. Might be relatively small, might be very large, depends on the region you're in, depends on the temperature increase you're actually facing. So that is one of the reasons that makes it extremely hard also to convince people to actually do something. I mean, I'm from Munich, and in Munich we seem to have quite a group of people who still don't believe in climate change. Yeah, I mean, I'm always surprised, but I think the scene, as you say, in Berlin is much different than it is in Munich sometimes. Or it might be the name EFO that's kind of attracting those people, I'm not quite sure. But whenever we have workshops or whatever, there's always the question, do you really believe in climate change? Climate change is not happening. If you compare the amounts of greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere to what we already have there, that can't make a difference, and the IPCC is lying anyway. Did you hear about this email exchange? I mean, this is kind of like the discussion that we have. So that's even the first step, not even the cost, how high are they, but it's even the uncertainty, does it happen? I mean, those people won't be convinced, I'm sure. But if we knew for certain, and the IPCC is basically saying we know almost for certain, then you could convince those people. But it's just not doable. There's always going to be some very small degree of uncertainty, which makes it very hard. And also then, if you actually consider, should I actually invest in mitigation or not, then exactly also the point is that if I do something, what I just said before, that might also have an impact on the decision of other countries. So you can't look at this optimization problem just from your specific country's point of view, but you have to also consider what the others are actually doing. And that is the debate. For example, some economists, like I said, argue we should not do anything in Europe before the others move. You can invest in adaptation, which is local, but we shouldn't do anything beyond that because we're just giving the others incentive to not do anything. This is the kind of reasoning that's behind that. So these are the costs and benefits that are considered by economists usually. But then there's also other things, further indirect benefits, which are in many cases not considered, which some might say goes beyond neoclassical economics. I don't really think so, because I mean it's still the same approach you can use. You just integrate other aspects that are usually not considered. That might be, for example, altruism. I'm not a firm believer in altruism. I mean, the way I have heard, I mean, I'm not an altruistic, no, I'm not, I might be, no, I'm not altruistic. That sounds weird, doesn't it? No, I mean, the reason is the way I have heard it defined, and there's probably also dispute about that, is that altruistic behavior is just if you do something and you don't get anything from that. And I argue that hardly ever happens. Warm glow, in contrast to that, is something that might not give you direct benefits in the form of more consumption or more income or whatever, but it gives you a good feeling. And usually if I do something good, I feel better. So I'm not altruistic, but I receive warm glow. The effect of both is that I might do something that does not give me a direct return, but I feel better afterwards. It gives me utility, so it can go into the utility function. And it might actually trigger voluntary mitigation, right? If I do something that I feel good, if I have green electricity, I might feel better than if I have gray or black electricity. What's even the term? Is it black? I'm not quite sure. Then, of course, also social norms. Social norms also define what we do. I mean, one very simple example is, I would guess that most of you wouldn't spit their chewing gum onto the street. Actually, the chance that you're observed by the police and get some fine, if there is a fine on something like that, is very small. But nobody does it because it's a social norm. You just don't do that. And stuff like that is also developing with respect to pollution, with respect to the type of car you use. If you use a car, whether you use a bicycle, in many people's minds, it's not really directed to I'm reducing CO2 emissions, but it's more like it's a social norm already to use a car which is not a gas guzzler. So social norms, ingrained behavior can also contribute to actually mitigate CO2 emissions, to behave differently. And there's also something which is called direct or also indirect reciprocity. But actually, if you do something for me, if you mitigate CO2 emissions, if you reduce them, I might do the same. I feel better if you do something, it makes me feel better if I also do something. Or I might also observe, that is direct reciprocity. I might also observe from far and just see that others might be getting active and agree to also contribute. Also, I haven't been part of that agreement before. That would be indirect. So there's a couple of more benefits for which economists usually don't credit that they actually think about them. But they do think about them, not necessarily all of them, but more and more, I would say. Because otherwise you can't really explain what you're observing. At least not if people are rational, which is a strong assumption. So these indirect benefits can actually help to explain these voluntary contributions to climate change. I don't know how many, 20 slides more, so I'm getting kind of fast now. Basically, the discipline in economics and also in other fields that deal with these type of strategic questions, do I invest, do I not invest, that's basically game theory. And there's lots of different games that have different outcomes, that have different, basically, material benefits and costs that are considered. I'm just going to go a little bit through that. I mean, that's basically the type of game that you have. What are the payoffs that you get from doing something? Would they lead to an equilibrium, a Nash equilibrium, to use the technical term? That would be that nobody does something. That would be a prisoner's dilemma game. Would it be a chicken game? A chicken game is a game where you actually have a catastrophical outcome if nobody is doing something. In that case, equilibrium would be that at least one, if you have two players, one would do something, the other wouldn't do something. So basically, those are the two outcomes. Either one can do something, the other does not. Then a stack hunt game. A stack hunt game is basically one where you get an equilibrium, both are doing nothing or both are doing something. And it basically depends also on what I believe what the other person does, where I get. So there's different types of games, and it's also the question which one is the most suitable for the case of climate change. I'm usually thinking that the chicken game, chicken in the sense of, oh God, I'm afraid, is a pretty good representation, because if we don't do anything, we most likely will have a catastrophic outcome. So this is also what I'm going to use in a second. Then, of course, the number of players plays a role, what we have just seen before. There's also, on the one hand, the theoretical analysis of these types of situations, but also then more and more, which is actually trying to set up a situation in which this game can be played by real players in reality, and then see what they actually do. And it's not always what you would expect, so sometimes the outcomes are not as dismal as theory would predict. So obviously there's more to people's behavior than what we usually consider. And then it's also the type of social dilemma, which can also play a role, whether it's actually it's fishery, it's flood protection, it's military defense, it's climate change. It just depends on the magnitude, it depends on the time horizon, it depends on the cost that you actually incur if you want to do something against or for it. So whatever you have here can get completely different outcomes. So it's a vast field that you're dealing with in the case of social dilemmas. But we're going to stick actually to the case of climate change. And the first thing I wanted to show you is just how Social norms, for example, can influence the behavior. Now we have a very simple example here. Two people, prisoner's dilemma game. So what that means is simply in a very simple matrix. Trying to get, there it is. Matrix depiction. We have two countries that can either cooperate or not cooperate. Now these are the payoffs that they get in the case that they both cooperate, that one cooperates, the other doesn't. Exactly the opposite, and if both cooperate. Now what you would like to have is actually this. The aggregate payoff is 4, it's the highest. So you would like to get there, but actually what you will get is the one with the circle, the dismal outcome, where nobody is cooperating. Because basically if you take the strategy of the other party or the other player is given, is always best for you not to cooperate. That's the problem. So just take the case, for example, of country 2. Country 2 we have here. Now if country 2 assumes that country 1 is cooperating, you see it would get the outcome 2 if it also cooperates. It would get 3 if it doesn't cooperate. What do I choose? I choose 3. On the other hand, if country 2 assumes that country 1 is not cooperating, it would get 0 if it cooperates then, but it would get 1 if it doesn't cooperate. Again, both don't cooperate, so we won't get an international environmental agreement, to put it there. So this is kind of like this prisoner dilemma game, which is always at the back of the mind of people when we talk about game theory, because it's the most simple game. And what happens if you actually integrate social norms in that? You basically would get, for example, this situation where you actually have a decrease of your payoffs in the case that, you don't cooperate. That is country 1, but the other country is cooperating. That could be, for example, guilt. I'm feeling guilty that I'm putting all the burden on the other country. So although my material payoff might be high, I still don't feel very good with it. So I just have the 1. And the other country, for that, might hold the same. So what do I get now? Basically, I get a so-called stack hunt game, where it should be at some point appearing there. And that basically means you would have 2 equilibrium now that you can reach. On the one hand, both cooperate, the other one, both don't cooperate, which is a little bit better because both could cooperate. If you're certain what the other person does, it really depends on your beliefs. If you just don't know for certain and you just assign a certain probability that the other party behaves in a certain way, then you might actually get either one, depending on what probability you assign. And that is what I wanted to deal with in a little bit, which I probably don't get to, but we'll see. So that is the very simple effect of social norms in this, in this example. Looks good, but as we will hopefully see, it's not always that simple. It might also go in a different direction. In this case, like I said, social norms can increase the prospect of cooperation. Now, one manifestation, if you want, of social norm is kind of is fairness. So I want to behave fair. This is kind of what probably everybody in this room would raise their hand for. Question is, of course, what is fair behavior? In the context of climate change, there's a lot of rules that could actually be, or that are described as fair behavior. There's the polluter should pay, polluter pay principle. There should be, everybody should be able to emit the same amount, egalitarian principle. Those who emitted the most, either today or in the past, they should reduce the most. Or a rule like that, the poorest shouldn't do anything at all, poor losers rule. So there's a lot of different concepts, and there's obviously no agreement on that. If you look at people who are involved in climate negotiations, you see that they usually mostly agree on the polluter pays principle, so who caused the problem should also contribute most to its solution, yes, to its solution. And the other one is the poor losers rule, that if you are too poor to do something, then you should be exempted from that. But what you also see, if you look a little bit more closer, is actually that the rule that you like most depends also on how much you have to pay if that rule is followed. So this is also kind of hinting to the fact that not everything that claims fairness is really necessarily fairness. It's kind of a good label, but sometimes it's just a front for following your own self-interest. So fairness, kind of difficult. And of course also what I not only think is fair, but also what I perceive as fair, what others do, depends on very much on my own situation. Funnily enough, if you ask people involved in climate negotiations, the EU is usually considered to be quite fair, in contrast to Russia, in contrast to the US, in contrast to China and many other countries. So obviously there's some reputation built up during the last years. Now, since fairness principles have been discussed up and down and also horizontally in economic literature, I'm kind of wanted to deal a little bit more about with the fairness perception. Because, like I said, it's not only really the fairness rule, but also do I feel that I'm treated fairly or not? And there's more and more also on that. It's not an extensive literature, but there are some contributions that actually looks a little bit closer at what actually happens if I feel treated fairly or if I don't feel treated fairly. And basically what, in a paper that is a co-authored paper with a friend and a colleague of mine, Dirk Rübbeke, what we actually differentiate with respect to fairness perception are two different kinds. It's always probably hard to really see them clearly always in reality, but the first one is what we label the intention-driven fairness perception. So do I feel that somebody else is treating me fairly in negotiations? If he contributes to climate protection, I probably feel more fair than if he doesn't. But also it depends on how he actually deals with it. That can be procedural fairness. So how is he going about it? Does he try to dictate the rules, or does he actually look for a mutual agreement for a more democratic solution? How is he behaving? What kind of solutions does he accept, etc.? That's also part of this intention-driven fairness. And that's not completely new. Basically, Rabin already in a paper in 1993 introduced a so-called kindness function. So he considered there are social norms that actually players are willing to give up some welfare for the good of others for fairness reasons, but he also said that I also play tit for tat. If I won't be behaving fairly if I have the feeling you don't behave fair towards me. So this is the kind of tit for tat strategy. So behaving fair also depends on how I perceive others, whether they treat me fair or not. So that's the one aspect. And the other aspect is the so-called consequence-driven fairness. And that's not that much discussed in the literature, but I think it's fairly important. I mean, it's kind of not always acknowledged, at least if you talk with people from the EU. But if you talk with people from developing countries, it's much different. That is so-called consequence-driven fairness. And that's basically also what follows from the actions of players in the past. So how much have countries, in this case, contributed overall to the problem? Not just this year, but in their entire history. And of course, if you look at the historical emissions, this is from 1850 to 2011, you get a completely different picture than if you look at the current emissions. You see in the historic emissions, who's leading is actually the US and the EU, almost head to head. And then China by now is actually on third place. But if you look at the current emission, then China has almost, not quite, but almost 30% by now. And of course, depending on what you think is relevant, you might get two completely different fairness rules and also two completely different fairness perception. Now, consequence-driven fairness perception basically claims that if I'm a developing country, that I expect more of somebody who's done a lot to contribute to the climate change problem as we have it now. That would be the upper part of that. Okay, kind of skipping the literature, I think. Just wanted to show you very shortly, based on a paper that I just mentioned with a colleague, how we actually go very simply about trying to model that. We just assume that we have two players, rich countries, poor countries, so R and P, developing industrial countries, and we then simply assume that on the one hand they get monetary payoffs from what they do, from protecting or not protecting the climate, but then they also affect it in their perception of how much they get by the fairness that they attribute to others. So basically we integrate a fairness parameter that can be kind of interpreted as if, or basically works as follows. If I think that somebody is fair, it will be very small. If I think that somebody is unfair, it will be large. And then we basically consider two different types of adjustments of the monetary payoffs. On the one hand, if I'm the only one doing something, so unilateral action, or if both actually are doing something. That's mutual cooperation. In the case of unilateral action, basically if I do something and the other doesn't, I don't like it. So basically, the higher the alpha, so the more unfair I think the other one is, the higher the SU will be. Now, if I think that actually both are contributing, I think that's fair. And actually, the lower the alpha, then the higher actually this additional benefit. So it's directly inverse, the two. I mean, this is just, I don't remember, I think I'm not going to go too much into that. That was actually the intention-driven part. This is the consequence-driven fairness part. Works very similar. And then we integrate that into this kind of strategy map that we had before. Now, but also considering that I don't know for certain what the... Oops. I was told I shouldn't do that. Here. Now, we basically assign probabilities to what we think that the other party is doing. So is it going to cooperate? Is it not going to cooperate? We don't know for certain. I mean, that's quite realistic, right? We assume it's a chicken game. So in pure strategy, so if I knew for certain what the other one would be doing, we would actually have, again, this kind of mixed result of one cooperating, the other not cooperating. Now, if I integrate these, this fairness adjustment for the rich countries, that basically leads to an adjustment on the one hand in the case of no cooperation with respect to historical fairness, assuming that they do feel some guilt if they don't do anything. And with respect to cooperation, if they do something, they kind of resent it if the others don't do anything. So this is intention-driven fairness, but they're happy if the other ones are doing it. So this is a plus. And kind of similar, we get an adjustment in the case for the poor countries. The same holds, of course, with respect to intention-driven fairness, but now the historical fairness is a little bit different. That's the H, the consequence-driven fairness. And basically, they especially resent it if they are doing something, they're cooperating, but the others are not. They're not even guilty of causing the problem, but they're doing something anyway, and the others don't, so that's really bad. If the others cooperate, they still resent that actually they have to do something because they didn't cause the problem, but they don't feel so bad anymore because the others are at least also contributing. So these are the kind of adjustments that we consider. Of course, if you have, for example, rich countries which don't feel any guilt, then these terms would simply be equal to 0. So now from what you have in this kind of matrix, you can actually calculate kind of a threshold probability that actually if I assign that for the other country to cooperate, this threshold probability, then I'm indifferent of what I do. Cooperating, not cooperating, the payoff would be the same. And now depending on what the true probability is that I assign, this is just the threshold, but depending on what I expect now, I cooperate or not. Basically, if the other country, if I assign a higher probability to the other country to actually do something, then in a chicken game, I wouldn't do something. And if I assign a lower probability, then I expect the other one not to do anything, so I would do something, because the outcome, if nobody does anything, would be rather bad. So what you can actually get in these so-called mixed strategies is actually every outcome. You not only get these cooperation, no cooperation equilibria, but if the expectations are, for example, that each country expect the other country not to do anything, they would both do something. And suddenly we're in equilibrium where both are cooperating. And the interesting thing, of course, now is, these are the so-called threshold probabilities. The interesting thing is, of course, what happens if the fairness perception is changing. And in the case of the intention-driven fairness, you have the terms highlighted here, which are affected in terms of consequence-driven fairness. You have the terms highlighted here. And you see that actually with respect to the consequence-driven fairness, with respect to rich and poor countries, developing and industrial countries, they enter rather in the opposite way. That's on the one hand the guilt, on the other hand the resentment. And with respect to the intention-driven fairness, obviously they enter exactly in the same way as, as they also enter the same in the metrics. Now, what happens if we actually increase the consequence-driven fairness perception? If I perceive that actually the countries that are responsible are doing more. I might not do that, but I perceive that they're considering their historical responsibility. From the if actually the developing countries believe that, then cooperation becomes more likely. And this is basically they get a higher payoff from cooperating. That's the resentment is lower because they feel to be treated better, so they are more likely to cooperate. And that then is exactly reflected in these probabilities. Same happens if the intention-driven fairness perception increases. If I feel that the others are treating me fairly, I reciprocate and also treat it fairly. But the problem really is with respect to the industrial countries, if they feel that they're taking their historical responsibility, or they're dealing with it better, that they are more fair, that means they don't feel that much guilt. If they feel less guilt, then actually the payoff difference between the I don't cooperate and I cooperate, I engage in climate change and I don't engage in climate change becomes lower. So it's actually becoming less likely that they're cooperating. So social norms not always work in a favor of mitigation or more engagement in climate protection. With respect to intention-driven fairness, of course, exactly the same. So this is the kind of like a very simple setup, like an economist would look at that problem. And I think it kind of is interesting in the sense that actually there's something that is we cannot observe. We cannot observe the feeling of somebody actually being treated fair or not being treated fair. But nevertheless, also empirical analysis shows that it might make a difference. So it's something that is usually outside of the realm of an economist only dealing with money or with consumption. But it nevertheless shows that there is a need to incorporate these concepts and also to perhaps incorporate, for example, psychology. How strong is this feeling? It's hard to say because there's no objective, of course, objective criteria for how strong it should be. It can be very different from country to country, depending on their situation. It's also should be interesting to incorporate sociology, political sciences, because we can only go so far and say there is an effect. But how strong it is, how we can actually influence that, is partly at least outside of the economics realm. Perhaps, I'm skipping that as well. I mean, one question that we actually looked at, because that seemed to be kind of relevant in the case of explaining voluntary contributions as rational, is actually the engagement in mitigation versus adaptation. Does it make a difference with respect to this incentive or this perception? And basically, there seemed to be something that actually adaptation should be or could also be rational. Why shouldn't it be rational? For example, in the context of climate financing, so basically industrial countries financing adaptation measures in developing countries, it doesn't seem to be rational at all at first glance. Because I don't get anything from that. I might get some warm glow, but I surely don't get any payback because most of the adaptation taking place is local in its benefits. So if there's a dike built in Bangladesh, obviously Germany doesn't really directly profit from that. And nevertheless, there is more and more means also dedicated to adaptation, to climate financing in general. It has increased at least a lot over the last decade. But also there's also more and more talk about adaptation. So why could that be rational? That's a good question. I'm just citing here the Conference of the Parties in 2010, where we had this pledge of 100 billion being transferred to or used for climate financing, so to foster projects that protect the climate or adapt to climate change in developing countries. And there is to be expected a fair share is going to go to adaptation. Now, if you look at, from our perspective, from this perception perspective, what would work better? Mitigation financing in developing countries or adaptation financing? If you finance mitigation, like with the clean development mechanism, what you're doing is you're helping these countries in a certain way because you invest there. Hopefully, I mean, that was the intention. You also contribute in other ways to sustainable development, although that didn't work out that well. But you also help yourself. You basically have a way to cheaply, I mean, that's the perception at least, to cheaply reduce CO2 emissions. And you don't have to do it yourself. So that might not be viewed that positively in developing countries because you try to kind of cheat out of your responsibility by dedicating as little as financial means as possible to it. I mean, from an economic point of view, it makes perfect sense, but that is kind of the perception that might be existing in other countries. Now, if you do adaptation, what would the effect of that be? I'm not going to go even in the details here, but adaptation is basically if I finance something that only helps the other country, doesn't help me, there's not much really I can say that this is not, that I'm not having good intentions, or that I might not be willing to face the consequences of my past actions, because climate adaptation is necessary because we, as industrial countries, caused the problem in the past. So that's actually really increasing the fairness perception. So that might be an explanation why actually adaptation becomes more and more popular, also on an international level. Also, it doesn't seem to really help or really reward the industrial countries who pay for it, but it might actually also be in the back of their mind that by helping the developing countries, they might also be more willing to actually to play a role in future climate protection, in mitigation. And I think that's a really fair assumption. I really do believe in that. There's, of course, if you look at the data so far, there's always Barbara Buchner. She's always doing a report on that. I think it's not yearly, but she's done it a couple of times now. It just shows how much climate financing is floating around between industrial and developing countries. You see that it is a lot. It's way more than the 100 billion that were pledged in the Conference of the Parties. It has decreased a little bit from 2012 to 2013, but what's just more interesting is that despite the decline, there's been at least a slight increase in adaptation, although adaptation is still very little in comparison to mitigation. Now I'm almost done, and I was told that an hour would be fine, so this is actually quite well. I mean, there's also other things that you can do, of course, that I haven't really touched so far. Punishment is kind of difficult. Like I said, there's a voluntary agreement, so how do you punish somebody if there's no court? You can actually take somebody to, I mean, have observed that even if you have a court, it might be difficult, like in the EU and the Euro crisis and the debt crisis. But it could also be something that, like installing border tax adjustment. That basically makes it harder for people who do not, countries who do not participate in climate protection to import their goods cheaply because they don't engage in climate protection. So border tax adjustment simply means that you kind of, at the border, put on top of what the price of the good is, the amount of money that would come from, for example, carbon taxes, if they already had been in place in the other country as well. So that's not a punishment, but it's kind of like an adjustment for the costs that arise due to climate protection. Increasing the time horizon is always a good idea. If you think more about what's happening in the future, you might be more willing to participate. If you think about a game as a repeated game, that actually if you kind of like lose the trust of others now, you won't perhaps never gain it back. That's also something you should consider when thinking about that, and it's a long-run problem. Technology development and transfer, as it was intended in the clean development mechanism, on the one hand shows good intention, on the other hand also sometimes just raises the opportunity to actually do something against climate change for not so high a cost. And of course public awareness increases, also a good idea in this context. Conclusions. Yeah, I mean, to date, so far, voluntary contributions are happening. They seem to be rational. They're not happening enough. So actually, what one should think about is what can I do, and actually to make it more attractive, to make it even not more rational, but for more people to think it's rational and not only think it's rational, be rational, and also for larger sums to be rational. Because so far, we won't get into a situation where we have an international institution anytime soon that could enforce the rules. Most important way to actually do that is considering the indirect benefits from climate protection. Fairness perception is one option to affect this willingness to cooperate. Basically, I've said all that before, but also I wanted to make a disclaimer at the end. Of course, what I've presented is a very simple representation of reality. Also, this 2x2 matrix, 2 players, one-shot game, certain assumptions about the payoffs that we have. Of course, I mean, it's kind of like it's just showing what could be possible. In reality, of course, situations are much more complex. There's also other aspects that you have to consider that all are outside of the model that I've presented today. But also, I mean, if you talk about people, or if you consider what type of model you want to use, always go for the simplest one that's showing what you actually want to do. And that is basically the simplest case that we can have here. So basically, it shows that there is an effect, that it can be positive. In most cases, it actually is, but it can also turn negative. So this is basically the objective we had, but in reality, there's also a lot more complex decisions. There's uncertainty about the payoffs that we didn't consider yet. I mean, it could be thought of as expected payoff, but of course, there's uncertainty. And what we have not really considered, we have so many, not only 2 different players, but we have a lot of heterogeneous players. And that is making things, of course, also more complex. And one thing that I would expect probably to come up in the discussion is basically the last thing I want to say is, of course, also the question, are individuals or country rational at all? I mean, that is, of course, always an assumption that we make, and that basically also experimental economics sometimes show that either we haven't understand the system, and it is rational, or it might not be rational at all. I mean, what I've presented today is actually kind of an enlargement of the typical view that in which we say, see things, and that might explain why things are rational that seem to be not rational at the first glance. But it still assumes, or tries kind of to find an explanation why people do that despite being rational. Are they rational? Perhaps on average. Probably not every single one. Yeah, and that's basically my conclusion, and I'm pretty much on time. Thank you very much for listening.